So here we are back in Mudbox. We just saved out that black and white PNG from Photoshop, so we're going to be able to see if that works without any weird issues. So as a recap of how to start sculpting on here, the most important thing is going to be, of course, to subdivide your mesh. So, this is already a pretty dense mesh by normal Maya standards, or at least for something as simple as this. But for sculpting, we need a lot more. So I'm going to just hit Shift D a few times, and I'm going to bump up each time as I add a new level in the number of polygons. Now, I don't know, I don't want to risk doing anything bad to my computer while I'm recording this, because I don't know how many polygons this can handle, but it doesn't hurt to make this really high up, because that's the whole point of this program, is to be able to sculpt with really high poly count, and that's how you're going to get the best detail. So the other most important thing besides that is to make sure that before you start, you create a layer. And this is because, just like Photoshop, we don't want to destroy the original layer and have to potentially restart if we mess up. So everything should be on a layer. All right, so if we just use our regular sculpting tool, we can see our brush. It's pretty darn large, so I'm not going to want to use that. I'm going to hold down B, make that smaller. You can see that over here as well. And I'm also going to want to lower this strength, because that is clearly a bit too strong, and by a bit I mean way off. So 2, and maybe even like 1 or like 0.6 or something like that. We don't want to get too crazy with this, because it is just an orange. It's not some sort of bas relief sculpture or something like that. So keep in mind that you're never going to have one standard size and strength setting that works for everything. It's all going to depend on the scale of your model and what detail you're painting. So speaking of detail, we can try out our stencil by going to Add Stencil. I can find that image I just made. And there we go. We have our stencil loaded in. Is this the greatest stencil ever made? Obviously not. But if we check out our controls over here, we can play around with our stencil, and we can just get sculpting. Now, once I get to the edge of this image, it will just stop because it doesn't have any more information. So we don't really want to do that, because we'll get a hard edge here. So apparently my my attempt at feathering the mask was really to no avail, unfortunately, but at least it was worth a try. However, that doesn't mean we can't play around with the fall off settings in Mudbox ourselves, so we can try to maybe make that edge a little bit less of a harsh fall off if we're lucky, or not if we're lucky, if we play around with it. So this is pulling out the surface a lot, and we're getting this much detail because we subdivided our mesh so much. And I don't know if I'm even going to want to use this stencil necessarily for the entire surface of the orange, just because it is very distinct with this scratch in it, and I don't necessarily know if I want that scratch to be repeating everywhere. So I'd want to make a mixture and use a mixture of different stencils, not just the same one over and over again. But that doesn't mean that we can't start out with a certain stencil that's kind of the base level stencil. So perhaps I might even want to make another layer, hide this one, make another layer, and try out one of these other stencils, and potentially see what those look like as a base layer. If not, we can also try the stamp. So remember that the difference between a stamp and a stencil is that the stamp literally changes the shape of the brush, and you can just paint with that shape. The stencil is only going to project through an image, which is what we just saw before. So for this, with the stamp, I could also try bringing in my image that I just made Keeps going to the wrong folder. And just, always experiment. Don't ever just assume that something's not going to work. So just because the other stamps are TIFFs doesn't mean that we can't use this. And so here we can't change the size of the stencil anymore because we're not using a stencil. So this is just going to be based on the size of the brush. And this is actually looking all right. Again, not necessarily the ideal stencil for a base coat because it's repeating that gash over and over again quite a lot. But we can still see that the stencil we just made from scratch is working the way we want it to. So in between there, I just added in another stencil that I did not make just now. This is a different one that I acquired. So this might be something more along the lines of what we want to use as our base level overall texture on the whole thing that's on here. I feel like my strength might be a little bit low, so I'm going to see what happens if I bump that up a little bit. Now this is like raising up the whole surface, which is technically going to affect the size of our orange in Maya, because when we apply this map it will bulge out to be the size that it is here. But we kind of just want to get this overall layer of the standard material, and then afterwards on a separate layer go in and put scratches and stuff around, so that we have a little bit more asymmetry to our orange. So if I had the wireframe, this is starting to look a lot more orangey now because we're just getting this general orange citrus texture on here. And I'm almost got the whole thing. Unfortunately, there's no real way to just like cover the whole thing with this. If you try to flood it, it just does not come out the way you want it to. If you don't believe me, you can go ahead and try it. But that is good for our base coat of this. And then I can make another layer, and you probably want to use a different. Don't use a stencil for this unless you have a specific scratch one. Actually, I take that back. You can use a stencil or a stamp